Hi, this is Cameron Cooper with Hi-Who, where we take a look back at landmark games of the past and see how they hold up to current industry standards and trends. Today, I'm looking at System Shock 2, which dropped in 1999. Met with a ton of critical praise, the game has garnered a cult following and boasts an active modding community. The game was one of director Ken Levine's earlier projects and is a precursor to Bioshock. The plot centers around the spaceship Von Braun, whose crew and computer systems have been infected by a strange alien virus known as the Many. The player, a military operative in cryosleep, awakens with no memory of how he got there. Von Braun head scientist and survivor Dr. Polito briefs the player on the situation, and so begins their attempt to wipe out the Many and save the ship. I've played the Bioshock trilogy to death, so was aware of the System Shock games, but never checked them out. Although I was originally planning on jumping in with mods, I decided to give the game a go vanilla in order to get the full 1999 experience. From the get-go, there are a few things that show the game's age. The art style is reminiscent of similar 90s cyberpunk titles, harkening back to dimly lit corridors and grimy air vents. The soundtrack also has that old-school industrial vibe that was all the rage at the time. That said, the game's sound and art both hold up fairly well, perfectly marrying the sci-fi and horror themes. Much like the Bioshock games, SS2 sees the player navigating a single complex. However, due to the Von Braun's entire layout being a mix between 2 or 3 scary corridors and the occasional room with a giant computer, it's incredibly easy to get lost. I often missed an area my first couple of whip-arounds because it looked too much like a path I'd just been down, or I simply couldn't see the door as it was tucked away behind a giant grey podium or obscured by poor lighting. This wasn't made any easier by the game's way of directing the player to their objective, which was done via the muddled grumble of Polito, generally at inopportune moments when being attacked and therefore dealing with shrieking monkeys and exploding robots, while trying to figure out which technobabble MacGuffin was in which generically named room.
Keep your eyes open. We must find a way to purge the information and get into the engine core. The ship must have some kind of backup system in place for just this kind of situation.
Player feedback is really the game's primary failing, and once again is a symptom of its time of release. Morrowind wouldn't drop for another 3 years, and action-oriented RPGs as we know them didn't exist. Western RPGs were essentially automated games of D&D. This was in itself problematic. D&D has a lot of stats, dice rolls, and other figures to worry about, which is why the game specifically has a player whose only job is to keep everything in check. For this reason, a game like System Shock 2 could be called overly ambitious. Throwing in some Doom-style dungeon crawling with a heap of RPG elements wasn't necessarily the best idea, and the game suffers from its complexity. Despite most of the gameplay centering around running down corridors and blowing things up with guns and plasmids, cybernetic enhancements, a heavily curated leveling up system greatly restricts what the player can and cannot use. I was constantly running into weapons I was unable to equip due to not focusing all my skill points into weapon handling. When I finally could use them, my gun jammed, and I needed to focus more points into a repair skill in order to bring it back to working order. Then, to stop it from jamming after 2 or 3 shots, I needed to work on my maintenance skill. Of course, increasing firing capacity requires yet another skill, so in order to actually use, say, an assault rifle adequately, I had to level up about 4 different skills. This is a level of complexity that has been slowly phased out of CRPGs for good reason. It pulls the player out of the game. I don't buy the idea that my character might know how to unjam a shotgun but have no clue how to stop it from happening, nor that he could fire a handgun just fine but be completely baffled by a laser pistol. This complexity wouldn't have been a problem if skill points had been easy enough to come by, perhaps through killing enemies, but they are only really acquired at certain points in the story. As such, it's easy to get locked out from accessing certain skills based on a few decisions you made early on. While Bioshock allowed the player to alter the character's loadout at checkpoints throughout, SS2's system basically means it's tough tits for any player who decides to pick psyops at the game's beginning, as they'll spend most of their time running across weapons they simply can't use. If the level design and gameplay had been balanced to reflect this in some way, that would be different, but the gameplay clearly favours combat-geared characters. Now, with all that said, things do start to change as you approach the game's end. You'll probably have amassed enough skill points to, if you guessed well enough, access some useful skills, and you'll start to feel somewhat competent. I will concede this is quite a rewarding feeling, but it came with a great deal of frustration. It takes a long time for you to feel like you're progressing in this game, which isn't helped by each mission being practically the same thing, packaged differently, nor the relentlessly respawning enemies, which jars with the game's overall themes. SS2 was originally a standalone title, drawing heavy inspiration from Heart of Darkness. Ideas of colonialism, power, and becoming a monster are a huge part of the Bioshock series. While the themes do crop up in SS2, overly aggressive AI and messed up spawn points ruin any sense of wrangling control, undercutting the game's message. In practice, this makes certain gameplay elements obsolete. Sometimes it becomes a lot more practical to take a speed booster and sprint past the enemies, as they'll just respawn on the way back anyway, and there isn't much reward for killing them. There is the argument that this keeps a player on edge, but giving them a problem they can't really solve doesn't build tension, it creates frustration. Most game breaking, however, is the player's respawn points. Like the Vita chambers in Bioshock 1 and 2, the game features respawn pods where the player can choose to respawn upon death, costing them a small amount of in-game currency. Unlike the Vita chambers, enemies can actually get up close to you when you respawn. Perhaps too close. This forced me to restart the game early on, as I was respawning constantly with two hybrids beating me to death moments after, the game having autosave just as that happened, trapping me in a perpetual state of death and frustration. This is easily remedied by just saving frequently and not using the respawn pods, sure, but having to avoid a game mechanic doesn't bode well. I know so far this review has been a bit negative, but I want to make it clear that I think SS2 is a good game. Essentially all the good aspects of Bioshock originate here. Gameplay wise, I really think this was a case of trying to do too much at once and ending up with a game that could be described as dense. Story wise, the game isn't anything to write home about, but if you're a fan of sci-fi horror a la Event Horizon, or enjoy the kind of themes played out in the Bioshock games, you'll probably get a lot out of it. While there are quite a few unmemorable audio logs, I did find myself becoming invested in some of the Vaughn Braun crew. The game does seem to focus a bit too much on being dark and scary, which makes it hard to take seriously. Sure, there are a few humorous lines here and there, and I'm not saying the game should have been a comedy, but a little bit of brevity would have given the grim, evil vibe of the plot a lot more gravitas. So, after all these years, how does the precursor to Bioshock hold up? The game goes for 10 bones on Steam and has a pretty active community complete with game-enhancing mods and player guides. While going in blind is likely to frustrate players, if you can see past the flaws and are willing to invest a few hours, it's certainly a wild ride you won't find elsewhere. For fans of the Bioshock, Deus Ex, or Dead Space games, this is a must-have. You don't have to complete it, but you sure as hell should check it out. This has been Cameron Cooper with Hi-Hu. Thanks for watching.